And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome aboard. I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Wednesday, December 11th, 2024. And we start with the sea ice. The main thing we have to deal with in the short term is a blizzard warning that is for the entire Arctic coast from Point Hope all the way through Utqiagvik east through Kaktovik, Demarcation Bay. There are going to be some very brisk easterly, polar easterly winds thanks to high pressure way up in the Arctic Ocean and a shot of Arctic air that's going to be drawn southwestward from the Canadian Arctic coast into the interior by the weekend. But ahead of that, pressure gradient really tightens up. East winds could gust 40 to 60 miles an hour along areas of the coastline, especially east of Utqiagvik through Prudhoe Bay to west of Kaktovik, some of the strongest winds across this region. And there could be some ice movement and shoving going on. It looks like areas here, some polynyas that have opened. As these winds increase, again, we could see some areas open up along the shoreline because of these strong easterly winds. We've had temperatures, though, quite mild still today on Wednesday, above freezing along areas of the lower Chukchi coast, especially down along the Seward coastline. Nome had a temperature of 45 degrees as of mid-afternoon with partly sunny skies. Now, further south, the ice has suffered from these milder temperatures this week. There's been some melting, plus the easterly flow has pulled the ice a bit westward, and we've lost some ice certainly here through Kuskokwim and Bristol Bays. And we're not looking for any notable regrowth, at least coming up here the next couple of days, though there will be a shot of Arctic air come quickly across Norton Sound into the northern Bering later this weekend and early Monday. But here's the way the weather map looks for overnight and into early on Thursday morning. We have the low that's sitting out just west-southwest of St. Matthew, and the remnants of that front that came up into the southwest interior, and then a front that's lifting northward from the Gulf with a secondary low backing up across the Kenai Peninsula. As moisture lifts northward, there will be a potential for a little bit of a light mix over the Kenai Peninsula. And then it's going to create a steadier band of light to moderate snow during the day on Thursday, and that'll continue through Friday afternoon into the evening. So there's going to be several inches of snowfall along and north of the Alaska Range, especially up through the Tanana Valley. But we find that this front is kind of a trough lingers there along the Gulf Coast for Thursday afternoon. There's a stronger low out into the western Aleutians, and as we go into Friday, that low still down into the 950s for central pressure and some stronger winds, higher waves. But this front, this Arctic front, is just going to push a little further south and then kind of wash out as the Arctic air heads eastward Saturday and Sunday. And that snow will continue into at least Friday morning and afternoon. So we're looking at southerly winds for the inner channels of the Panhandle on Thursday at 10 to 15 knots, waves 2-3 feet inner channels, Lynn Canal, Stevens Passage, but 6-8 feet here down toward Metlakatla. For the outer coast, winds generally with some sort of west-southwest component around 10 knots, and waves generally running 12 to 13 feet. On Friday, winds will be southeast 15 knots, Petersburg up through Juneau and Skagway, waves 3 feet, but north winds to 10 knots with 7-foot waves down there south of Metlakatla. And look for northwest to north winds 10 knots, Sitka southward to off of Craig with 10-foot waves, and off of the icy strait out west of Gustavus and outside of Yakutat Bay, easterly winds 10 knots with waves around 8-9 feet. For the northwestern Gulf, within Prince William Sound, southeast winds 15 knots, 3-foot waves. South-southwest winds here outside of Hinchinbrook entrance at about 15 knots with 10-foot waves. Strongest winds will be lower Cook Inlet into Kennedy entrance. We're looking at westerly winds on the order of 20 to 25 knots with gusts of 30 to 35 knots possible and 6 to 7-foot waves. Those winds continue to come down on Friday with that just lingering troughiness over this region. Variable winds outside of Hinchinbrook entrance around 10 knots. Easterly winds 15 knots within Prince William Sound, waves a few feet. Northeast winds 10 to 15 knots down the length of Cook Inlet, becoming westerly there out of Kamishak Bay and with waves lower Cook Inlet and the entrance running a few feet. On Thursday, Kodiak Island will see southwest winds 20 to 25 knots, and as we trail out down along the Alaska Peninsula, winds become more westerly and even pick up again 30 to 35 knots, especially north of Cold Bay, where waves can be running as high as 13 feet. And then on Friday, southwest to west winds 25 knots here in the vicinity of Kodiak Island. On the North Pacific side, we're looking at west-southwest winds 25 knots before they turn back toward the southeast. Southwest winds into Bristol Bay 25 knots on Friday, but more southerly there north of Cold Bay, waves 8 to 9 feet on the Bering side. For the eastern Aleutians, 25 to 30 knot westerly winds. Those winds become more southerly and increase to 45 knot gales west of Adak, where waves could build 15 to 18 feet for Thursday. And then on Friday, with that stronger wound-up system in the southwestern Bering, we have southerly gales to 35 knots around the far eastern Aleutians, around Unalaska, and then they fall off to 25 knots Nikolsky through Atka. But once we get west of Adak, we have gales again, southwest gales 40 knots between Adak and Kiska, and then west of Kiska, storm force winds of 50 to 55 knots, and seas could build in excess of 25 to even over 30 feet here, 36 feet there south of Shemya. And for areas of the southeast Bering and the Pribilovs, westerly gales of 40 knots expected on Thursday, 18-foot waves around St. Paul, St. George. Southwest winds 20 knots into Bristol Bay, south winds into Kuskokwim Bay with 3-foot waves. And then we still have easterly flow, though not as strong as the past few days. Easterly winds 10 to 15 knots with ice in place here along the lower Yukon coast up through Norton Sound. And for Friday, winds will be southwesterly to southerly into Bristol Bay and Kuskokwim Bay at 20 knots with 3-4-foot waves. Out toward the Pribilovs, look for south to southeast winds 30 to 35 knots with waves upwards around 10, 11 feet. Offshore southeast winds 15 knots along the lower Yukon Delta, and then southwest winds 10 knots into Norton Sound. Now for areas along through the Bering Strait, look for northeast to north winds 10 to 15 knots. But those winds really pick up once you get north of Point Hope and Cape Lisburne. Wainwright, easterly winds at 30 knots, but once you get up toward Utqiagvik, eastward to Kaktovik, 35 to 40 knot easterly gales with higher gusts. That's why that blizzard warning is in effect for the entire Arctic coast, but some of the worst conditions will be between there, Utqiagvik and Kaktovik, Thursday into Friday. And as we go into Friday, those winds continue out of the east, 35 to 40 knots there along the Beaufort Sea coastline with blizzard or near blizzard conditions, and ice movement certainly possible with that. Still 35 knot easterly gales off of Wainwright, but as we drop down toward Point Hope, they fall off to about 25 knots from the east through the lower Chukchi Sea, and if there is any open water between where there are some opening in the ice, there could be waves of 4 to 5 feet. And then on the north side of St. Lawrence Island, winds are expected to be southeasterly at 15 knots and generally south-southwest winds along the western and southern shoreline of the Seward Peninsula on Friday.